12 degrees Fahrenheit. Last week, it was like 40 degrees. The hell, New England. All right, no time for complaining. Time to cut. All right. Not bad. Try that again. That didn't work. Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Mike and today we got some awesome caffeine. It's snowy out and we also have swords to talk about. So overall, a pretty good day. And so what we're looking at here today is the Munich Cut and Thrust sword by Windlass Steel Crafts. This sword goes for about $325 US. At least that is the price that is listed on Cult of Athena's website. And of course I will put down in the description below a link as to where you can find this sword on Cult of Athena, and also some measurements and some specs. So if you are interested in some further information, you can go ahead and check it out. So what is this sword attempting to replicate? Well, it's modeled on the Munich town guard swords that date from the beginning of the 17th century, so somewhere between 1600 and 1610. Now these swords were, it's a group of swords that actually there are many surviving original examples still left in private collections as well as in museums. And they were a group of swords that were created to outfit the Munich town guards. It's like a quasi police force / home defense force. These guys were armored and they also carried weaponry, including these type of swords here. This is a sword type commonly known as a side sword. So yeah, it's a lot like a rapier in the hilt portion, in the sense that it has a complex swept hilt design with all of these bars for protection. But the blade is very different than a rapier blade, and we're going to take a look at that in a second. So let's go ahead and take a look at the different pieces of this sword and how Windlass did in terms of its execution and overall fit and finish. We'll talk about some handling characteristics, and then I'll go ahead and give you guys my final opinion of this really cool and interesting design and sword. All right, guys, first part of the sword we're going to look at is we're going to take a look at this hilt portion, starting with the pommel. Now, this is a threaded pommel, and you know, some people like threaded pommels, some people don't. I generally think if they're well done, then there's not a problem with it. This one is actually pretty well done. Now, when the sword came out of the box, this was a little loose. All I did was tighten it up, and it hasn't loosened since. Even through all of the testing that I did, it still hasn't really loosened. So it's generally a pretty good design. It's a very big, thick, heavy pommel, and as it compares to the originals, it's not entirely accurate. The originals are sort of flattened and taper a little bit. Now I can see the reason why they did not do it with this particular model, because this is a threaded pommel. So if you were to turn it and tighten it a little bit more, the flattened section would just not line up with the rest of the sword components and it wouldn't look right. So they decided to go with a much more rounder, overall symmetric shape to avoid that issue. The only problem is that this pommel is larger and heavier than it needs to be, which adds to the overall weight to the sword. Now, one thing I want to say right now is that the sword is kind of heavy. It is a beefy, heavy bladed sword, but most of the weight is over here in this hilt area, which, as I understand it, is not all that different than the originals. The originals were beefy, heavy swords, and obviously I'll put some links down in the description below as where you can see some pictures of the originals and some collections and whatnot. But this is very heavy and weighted in this section. A lot of that has to do with this pommel, which some people have taken it off and weighed it, and as I understand it, it weighs about a pound, which is a little bit too heavy. So I think this is one area where they could improve on this sword, is getting the pommel correctly shaped and also a little bit lighter. And maybe a peened construction would be a little bit more advantageous and I think more desirable to a lot of different collectors. The grip is actually nicely done. This is steel wire wrapped with, I think this is called Turk's Heads style wrap here on the ends. It's pretty nicely done. However, you can see that there are some gaps here and here in the wrap where you can kind of make out the wood core grip underneath. Overall, in this price range, I don't think it's that big of a deal, but generally speaking, it is done rather nicely. And I can imagine that this is not easy to do, so I'll give it a pass on these imperfections and whatnot. And overall, it's pretty comfortable. However, it is a little bit slippery. I can imagine that these swords would have been used with gloves, considering that it's a guard unit or a military unit that would be using this stuff. So they would probably have other gear, including gloves. And I feel like this sword handles much better, and the grip is much more comfortable and easier to use if you're actually using gloves. But overall, it has a very nice shape. I like how it's rather small, kind of like the originals. However, I do think the originals had a shorter grip, but once again, that's kind of nitpicking. Moving on to the other portion of the hilt is all of these protective bars and just this awesome hilt construction, which gives this sword quite a really cool look and just, I think it kind of makes the sword in terms of aesthetics, and I really like it. Now, these bars are all welded together, and you can make out some of the welding spots and sort of imperfections and whatnot, but that's okay. I think, once again, I think it's passable for a sword in this price range. There is a version of the sword put out by Arms and Armor, which is probably, I think, around $1,200 to $1,300, so much more expensive than this, which has a cleaner, better, more historically accurate design, but you're gonna pay for that. So you know, once again, this is a $325 sword, so imperfections like this are to be, I think, expected, although not desired. Anyway, these bars provide a ton of protection, and one thing that's really cool is that when you are gripping the sword, you are supposed to have your finger over the guard here in these protective bars, these loops here. And when you do that, the sword tends to come alive a little bit more. You can cut that way, and you can also thrust that way, or you can just hold the sword in a regular hammer grip like such, and it's pretty comfortable both ways. I found it a little bit easier to control the blade when you have your finger over the guard here, which I think is how it's meant to be used. But if you're doing powerful cuts and you're not really considering accuracy or maneuverability that much, the hammer grip works great. Yeah, it's one of the features of the sword, all of this stuff here, that I really like, and it's very characteristic of this type of side sword. So overall, I think the hilt portion was pretty well executed. Like I said, there's imperfections. These bars are thicker than they need to be, which adds some more excessive weight to the sword. This sword weighs in at 3 pounds 4 ounces. On Cult of Athena's website, they're advertised at 3 pounds 6 ounces, so this one is a little bit lighter. However, that is pretty heavy for a one-handed sword. Essentially, guys, this is a lot like a medieval arming sword. It has a medieval arming sword blade, something that we would call a Type 18 style blade, which is a flattened diamond cross-section blade with the center ridge here. So basically a medieval arming sword blade with a complex swept hilt design. So there is a lot of weight here in it, but it is in fact a one-handed sword, most indefinitely a one-handed design. You don't use this with two hands. So 3 pounds 4 ounces is actually quite heavy. However, I will say that overall, even with its weight, which I think is a little too heavy for this type of sword, it's still well balanced. You can still maneuver it and cut with it quite well, as you can see from the test cutting footage that I showed at the beginning of the video. So well balanced, and I am going to talk about ways to improve that balance in a little bit of why I think it is a little bit overweight. We already talked about the pommel, and the bars I think are a little bit too thick and heavy. But the other reason for the excessive weight is, of course, comes with the blade. Now, let's take a look at this blade. Like I've already mentioned, it is basically a Type 18 arming sword blade. It's not hollow ground. I think if they had, let me see, actually, is it hollow ground? No. If they had hollow ground the blade, I think it would have performed better. It probably would have saved on weight, but one of the biggest problems is it doesn't have any real degree of distal taper. I mean, I think it has a little bit towards here at the end, but it doesn't have the correct distal taper for this type of sword. Now, one thing I want to say is that the sword came, for Windlass Steelcrafts, came pretty sharp. I did do a little bit of sharpening on it, not too much. I just honed the edge a little bit, and now it actually cuts quite well. But out of the box, it came quite sharp, quite pointy, and I was actually pretty pleased with the sharpness out of the box, because that's obviously a point of contention among many sword collectors and sword enthusiasts when they buy swords and they don't come sharp. So how does the thing handle? Like I said, it's a little bit overweight. It could definitely be improved with the pommel, the bars, and adding some distal taper. I think that would do a lot to handle the excessive weight of the blade. However, like I had already said, it's not it's not unwieldy, and you can use it quite effectively. It does take some practice to learn how to use a sword that is weighted in this manner with all this excessive weight back here, but it's not terribly hard to learn how to use, and once you do, it cuts quite effectively. It's not super nimble, and you know that's something you have to understand right off the bat, and I don't think the originals would have been incredibly nimble either, but you know, it's very powerful. It is a powerful cutting sword, and it thrusts extremely well also. Yeah, that's pretty much all I can say about its handling characteristics. It's a beefy combat sword for sure, and you know, with improvements, it would be even better. So my general opinion of the thing is, I think it's a good sword. Like I said, there's only one other option out there on the market, and it's the example from Arms and Armor, and that is a high-end sword. So if you're interested in getting one of these side swords and learning to appreciate this type of design and you know, wielding a sword with these features, this is a very good option. I think I can definitely recommend it. It has a lot going for it, especially within its price range. It needs to be improved, and it's one of the things I think that's frustrating about Windlass Steelcrafts is that they have the ability to do a lot of cool things and you know, make swords that are of decent quality, especially for the price. It's unbeatable, but they do lack these details which would really knock these things out of the park, and it doesn't look like it would take that much more money, maybe a little bit more time in development, but if they just nailed some of these things down, swords like this would be incredible, and I think would be snatched up by enthusiasts and collectors and people who are interested in history. I think they would have a higher sales because they do have some incredibly cool designs. So yeah, overall, I'm pretty pleased with the sword. I can recommend it. Just know that, you know, if you're looking for perfection with a sword like this, you're not going to get it. But I'm sure many of you guys are familiar with Windlass Steelcrafts. So, you know, it's the usual issues with their swords. Really cool designs, very affordable, but overall, I think it's a very good sword. So thanks for watching, guys, today. Stay tuned for more sword reviews. I got some more things coming up, and there's a lot to review for 2022. I have a tremendous backlog of stuff to take a look at, and we're going to look at some other types of weapons besides swords. So yeah, thanks for coming by, guys. As always, stay safe, and I'll see you guys next time.